the achievement of mass prosperity, of mass affluence, has brought higher expectations into view of having self-fulfillment, of having a flourishing life. But the institutions which have made us rich and some of the cultural responses to getting rich have made it rather difficult to make that transition to mass flourishing. At a high level, what we need is a kind of countercultural movement. So seeing this pop-up village, which had Web3 associations, but focused on flourishing and multi-generational living, that all seemed, well, that's interesting. When I got there, I just had the wonderful experience of being around a bunch of smart, optimistic, future-oriented people who were interested in ideas in a way that was refreshingly different from the kind of hard-bitten cynicism of Washington, D.C. That just a sort of an ingenuous interest in cool ideas and trying them out for size and playing with them, that kind of intellectual openness was revitalizing.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Edge City podcast. I'm Timour, and this series is all about exploring the ideas and experiments that are pushing at the edges of tech, science, and society. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Brink Lindsey. Brink writes one of my favorite blogs called The Permanent Problem, and he is a senior VP at the Niskanen Center, which is a DC think tank that promotes policies that, amongst other things, aim to advance human flourishing. It was very interesting to hear the perspective of someone who works at the highest levels of policy thinking in the US. And we touch on why the transition from mass prosperity to mass flourishing is so complex, how the current system is in what he calls a triple crisis, and some of the things that we can do about it. There are a lot of ideas here that have profound implications for how we live well and thrive. So with that, let's get into the show. I am here with Brink Lindsey. Brink, thank you so much for joining me.
Timour, it's a pleasure.
So I'd love to start with laying some groundwork. You write an excellent Substack called The Permanent Problem, and I'm curious why you picked that name and what is the permanent problem in your eyes?
Permanent problem is a line from an essay by the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who in the depths of the Great Depression in 1930 came out with an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he was looking ahead 100 years to right around now. His message was, the Great Depression feels like a catastrophe, but this is just a bump in the road. We are on the path towards long-term growth, and barring some sort of unimaginable catastrophe, by the time our grandchildren are our age, the world will be 4 to 8 times richer. At that point, he said, the specter of material deprivation, which has haunted mankind since his origins, will be gone. And therefore, the economic problem, as he defined it, will be basically solved. He said, solving the economic problem, though, will bring mankind's permanent problem into view, which he defined as how to live wisely and agreeably and well with the blessings that science and compound interest have bestowed upon us. My Substack is premised on the idea that the melees of the 21st century that we're experiencing, the slowdown in growth and dynamism, the reemergence of class conflict, and the kind of cancer of social disintegration, the dysfunctional mess of our politics, all of this can be understood as sort of the messy no man's land between mass prosperity, which we have achieved, and mass flourishing, learning to live wisely and agreeably and well with our blessings. As it turns out, the achievement of mass prosperity, of mass affluence, has brought higher expectations into view of having self-fulfillment, of having a flourishing life, of having self-actualization. But the institutions which have made us rich and some of the cultural responses to getting rich have made it difficult to make that transition to mass flourishing. My Substack, and now I'm turning it into a book for Oxford Press, is about this messy transition, what is going wrong and how we might put things right.
So Keynes imagined a future where people worked 15-hour weeks and focused on the good life and living agreeably, wisely, and well. Why has that vision failed to materialize? I'm curious if you have a view on that.
Yeah, so Keynes, when he looked in his crystal ball, got some things very right. He guessed that we would be rich. He got some things very wrong. He guessed that by now we would only be working about 15 hours a week, that we would have successfully transitioned to non-economic pursuits. But he also got right the fact that this transition to facing the permanent problem would be traumatic for society, that unlearning the habits of countless generations in a few decades was going to be hard going. He predicted something like a general social nervous breakdown in the transition. And that seemed like a pretty apt descriptor of where we are right now. As far as why he got the hours wrong, I think there's a few things going on. First, He had a fairly parochial Oxford or Cambridge Don's vision of what flourishing was. We have discovered that a lot of people within the white-collar professional managerial world, work has evolved to becoming something that is intellectually interesting and challenging and has its own intrinsic rewards. The division between work, which is soulless toil, and leisure, which is the real me coming out, that division's far too harsh. And so I think especially people in the privileged upper quarter of society are actually working longer hours now than they were in our grandparents' day. A good deal of that is due to the fact that they are deriving extra satisfactions from. Furthermore, Keynes didn't foresee the sort of commercialization of leisure, all kinds of opportunities to spend money on your days off, which gives you incentives to work harder so that you can play harder. Those are all important factors. One thing that we may get to later is that as our incomes go up, we split the difference. To some extent, we spend more. To some extent, we buy more leisure. That was more obvious in the first half of the 20th century when work weeks were actually going down. We stabilized at a 40-hour work week. But since then, lifetime working hours have continued to decline with later entry into the workforce, with education, and earlier exit with longer retirements. So lifetime working hours are continuing to decline. We are continuing to buy more leisure as we're rich. So Keynes wasn't completely wrong. Part of the problem is that we have allowed, through regulatory gold plating, costs of living to escalate along with income in a way that the distance between the two isn't opening up. I see as an important goal for technological progress in the decades ahead to raise ordinary workers' real income, not through boosting their pay, but through dramatically reducing the cost of living. And in that way, we can have a lot more people who are, in Keynes's fashion, independently wealthy. They can choose to work part of the year or to work in their 20s and 30s and retire in their 40s. They're not chained to a 40-hour work week for decades of their life.
What I find really fascinating about this is that, of course, there are always going to be people that, like you said, belong to maybe the privileged few who find agency and meaning and excitement in their work. But it's not like for the folks that don't view work that way, things have gotten that much easier in terms of the amount they're working. Maybe you're right, they're entering the workforce a little later, maybe they're retiring a little earlier, but there still hasn't been that meaningful change there. And I think we'll get into that because I think you write about this well. But first, one of the things I really love about your thinking and your writing is that you have had a fascinating intellectual evolution. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like from small government libertarianism to now writing that you sometimes even cringe when you read some of your earlier works and some of your earlier views. Yeah. So I'm curious, how did your perspective change and why? And it would be amazing if you could trace that evolution.
I've wandered quite a bit over the course of my life, both intellectually and geographically. Here I am living in Thailand on the other side of the world. Some of my views about the world are on the other side of the world from what they were in decades past. I discovered libertarianism in the 1970s, which was a very good time, an appropriate time to discover libertarianism, where I think its partial truths lined up very well with the challenges of the day.
Could you define it briefly, and just in case anyone doesn't know?
Yeah, so just a general idea of prioritizing freedom as the highest political value, and therefore seeing the biggest threat to freedom as government coercion, therefore imagining a government having as small and humble a role as feasible. My turning away wasn't some sort of gigantic break. It was more just feeling over the course of the 21st century that the big challenges of the day weren't really aligned with the answers that libertarianism was providing. That led me to a broader abandonment of the whole idea of ideological thinking. For any ism which privileges one value above all others, I've decided that map doesn't do justice to the complexity of the territory. The human good is pluralistic and incommensurable. We can't optimize. All we can do is balance competing and rival goods in a way that's not stable over time, so we have to keep doing it. My thinking has wandered away from the idea that there is a clear blueprint for social change. I still have a number of libertarian instincts, and I think those are important. Distrust of centralized power, belief in the power of bottom-up, voluntary cooperation, belief in the social technology of markets, but I just don't see that is providing all the answers in the way that I want to.
Yeah, it does feel like there's something grounded in truth there, and yet it cannot be the only answer. One particular point you made that I thought was interesting was that you had an earlier belief that declining trust in government, which it seems like we've been on an arc of that happening over the last few decades, that declining trust in government would actually lead to smaller, better governance. You saw that as a sign of the increasing realization of the lack of capacity of government to affect change.
When I was a libertarian in the 80s and 90s, we saw public trust in government just on steady decline. The Gallup started asking the question in the late 50s, and maybe 70% of people trusted the government to do the right thing. Now it's in the teens. Back then it was in the 20s or 30s. And so we thought this is progress, right? That people have been bamboozled into believing in big government, and now they're finally wising up and seeing that it's a racket. Once they become wiser and more skeptical of government's claims, we're on our road to libertopia. What I have discovered and what the last few U.S. election cycles have made abundantly clear is that declining trust in government doesn't mean declining trust in power or charisma. It means declining trust in established institutions. Declining trust in established institutions means increasing credulity towards demagogues, because if you believe the status quo is a racket and governing elites are corrupt, you get desperate. Anybody who comes along and offers to smash the system looks like the answer. That's where we are in one country after another. Right now, democracy is under assault because the legitimacy of established institutions and governing elites is in peril.
And therefore, we're seeing this move towards
search for alternatives.
I'm curious, from your perspective, how has DC changed in the last couple of decades, and maybe the think tank world in general, what it means to do politics?
Well, everything's changed in the past 10 years. Ideological categories have been scrambled. The Reaganite small government mixed with social conservatism, mixed with assertive, muscular foreign policy formula fell apart when Donald Trump blew it up in 2016. And so
that was like 3 decades of kind of Republican
orthodoxy. But he blew that out of the water. Every other candidate running against him in 2016 was towing that line, and he was having none of it. He said Iraq was a disaster. He said he wasn't going to cut Social Security or Medicare. He was flouting the Reaganite consensus left and right. Since then, intellectuals on the right have been trying to cobble together something to ride on the coattails of Trumpism. That's clearly where the power is on the right. So how do we make intellectual sense of that? So that's going on this kind of populist nationalist right. The left went through a big sort of ideological spasm over the past decade of this new style of extreme social justice activism. I think we've seen a significant retreat from that in the past few years as its political toxicity is becoming clear. So the intellectual environment is very unsettled, and that's very different from how things were in the 80s and 90s when the battle lines were quite set. Meanwhile, for talking heads and scribblers who believe in evidence and persuasion, it's clear that passions rather than reason are ruling the day politically. You can just spew utter transparent garbage, right? That's not even within hailing distance of the facts. And if it suits the prejudices of your team, they're going to gobble it up. In that environment, coming out with studies and citing evidence feels almost like a category error sometimes. Nonetheless, underneath the sound and fury of the culture war, there is the fact that 90+% of government's work is just too boring to turn into fodder for the culture war. Therefore, there still is policy being made, and there still are legislators that are actually trying to write laws and make things better. That kind of work is going on, but it's going on with insane distractions all around.
I feel that 90% of the things that grab our attention as consumers of political media or media in general is a tiny fraction of what's actually happening. I'm curious, in your work, because you guys at the Niskanen Center, you do bipartisan work, has the vibe of that shifted in terms of being able to bring both parties to the table and advance policy ideas?
Once you're outside of the shouting zone, there is remarkable openness. The people on Capitol Hill, Republican offices, Democratic offices, will work pragmatically with people. If it's an issue they're interested in, they will work across the aisle. They will work with outside agents. If you're trusted to tell the facts correctly to an office, not only the facts about the issue, but also about the coalitional structure, who's on board with this and who's not, what other offices are thinking. Congress is so pathetically understaffed that there's a huge need for what we call a legislative subsidy. Most of that is provided by lobbyists. They provide all the information that legislators need because they don't have staffs to do it for themselves. Unfortunately, they're getting their information from interested parties, and that kind of messes things up. So think tanks act like lobbyists for their vision of the public interest. I've described being in a think tank as a cross between being a professor without any students and a lobbyist without any clients. It's quite remarkable how, if you've got a reputation of being a straight shooter, even pretty serious ideological and partisan differences aren't a bar to working constructively on issues of common concern.
It's very interesting to hear, and I guess comforting in some ways, because it just seems like an absolute circus from the outside. Yeah. But I'd love to just take a quick interlude here and talk about a topic that you and I have discussed in person. And it's something we talk about quite a bit at Edge City, which is this idea of human flourishing. And it's something you've written about very well. And I'd love for you to unpack how you define human flourishing and maybe go into some detail around the idea.
Sure. Yeah. So my book is about trying to get to a society of mass flourishing. So obviously the question is, well, what does that mean? First, you have to think, what is flourishing at the individual level? And then what does it mean for a society to flourish? I think there's distinctions and different things when you look from those different angles. I don't have any claims to any kind of originality here. These questions have been on the table. What is the good life? Since people have been asking questions, but I'll just give you how I've worked out my conception of things and how that sets the sort of evaluative standard that I use in judging how things are going. For individual flourishing, there is no room for either dogma or relativism, right? So there isn't one very narrowly circumscribed way to live a good life. And yet we are human beings. We have a nature. There are some things that just don't work for us and some things we need. The way I see human flourishing is endless variation on a few basic themes. So the three main avenues for flourishing, I'm sure you could divide it in a different way, but the way I find it useful to divide it is projects, relationships, and experiences. So projects, any action you do out there in the world to change the world. Relationships, clearly your connections with other people, and experiences, just your openness, the sensory and perceptions and conceptions that you receive just being alive. And I think all of those can give us joy and fulfillment, and they intersect, those three avenues intersect. So a marriage or parenthood, that's a project as well as a relationship. And in our projects, we build relationships with the people who are doing the projects together. And sometimes those are our strongest relationships. Interesting projects produce fulfilling experiences of flow and mastery. So they're all jumbled up. We can't be terribly prescriptive about what kind of projects and what kind of relationships and what kind of experiences work for people, because people are very heterogeneous. Some people, maybe their projects won't amount to much of anything, but they have really deep, intimate, and powerful relationships. And some people may be so absorbed by their projects that their need for human contact is just less than other people. They live a relatively solitary life, and yet by their lights, they are flourishing. Some people develop a great capacity for cultivating gourmet experiences, live life as a bon vivant. And so a bunch of different ways to skin the cat. As far as a flourishing society, I think there are more constraints in that while there are plenty of activities that at the individual level, you could do them or not and have a great life, some level of that activity is going to have to be going on in that society for the society to be flourishing. Most obviously, having babies, right? So you can have a flourishing life without ever having children. You cannot have a flourishing society if there isn't a critical level of parenting going. We're running up against that problem right now. I think we can see tensions between individual flourishing, the conditions for individual flourishing, and the conditions for collective flourishing. I think most people, their relationships in their life are a more important component of their well-being than their projects. But there's a creative minority of people who sometimes make life anxious with all of their overturning of apple carts and trying to do things new ways and reports of temptations over the next hill that can unsettle things. So there's a conflict, or a tension at least, between an inclusive society and a dynamic society. But I think that tension is internal to human nature. Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, talked about humans' social unsociability or unsociable sociality. We are simultaneously deeply, profoundly dependent on other people and individually willful and competitive. Both of those aspects of human nature must be expressed for flourishing to occur. Flourishing means realization of your potential. A flourishing society is going to be one which is inclusive, which gives people that rootedness, but which also has a dynamic character, which is open to experimentation, discovery, trial and error, and creation.
It seems to me that with something where there's such diversity in how and what it means to live well, it's a difficult thing to start to think about policy or systemic change in how to approach increasing or getting to a place of mass flourishing. Some of the tools that we can use in that process are things like metrics, different ways to measure flourishing. Yep. Do we think about the average? Are we utilitarians here? Do we think about total? I'm curious if you could touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's another aspect of flourishing, I think, is we can talk about the difference between average flourishing in a society, peak flourishing, what the people at the very top that are doing, and total flourishing. So let's march through human history and see how these change in relation to each other. Two huge phase changes in the human story, the invention of agriculture and the Industrial Revolution. So we go from hunter-gatherers to hundreds of thousands of years of that to sedentary farmers. And then a couple hundred years ago, we go from an agrarian society to a technology and organization intensive industrial society. That's a dramatic, profound transformation in the human condition. But the first transition made possible civilization. So when hunter-gatherers, you have no possibility of acquiring, developing any surplus. You're always on the move. But farmers can store food, settle down in one place. Out of that surplus, meager as it was, grew everything we know as civilization. But everything we know as civilization was basically the handiwork of a tiny extractive elite. 95% of people were engaged in subsistence agriculture and probably had a lower nutrition level. We see that they were shorter than typical hunter-gatherers of the Stone Age. And so here we see the move from hunter-gathering to agrarianism. For average flourishing, maybe a drop in terms of access to nutrition. In peak flourishing, an enormous jump, right? And then also in total flourishing, an enormous jump. There were about 5 million humans when farming was first developed. Around the time of the Industrial Revolution, there were 1 billion. So a huge increase in the total number of people experiencing life and getting to laugh and fall in love and see sunsets and flourish, at least to that extent. I think all of those dimensions are important. We can't just worry about average flourishing. We can't just be effective altruist utilitarians worrying about mosquito nets. We need to worry about beauty and excellence as well. But if you're just worried about peak flourishing and you're not interested in average or total flourishing, then you're going to wind up in a very dark fascistic place politically before you know it. So I think a lot of sort of mistakes and moral errors in flourishing are an attempt to not face up to its complexity and the fact that it has different aspects that have tensions with each other. We can't ignore any of us.
How did those metrics change in the Industrial Revolution and the aftermath?
Yeah, so just an enormous increase in material well-being, right? You see those graphs of GDP per capita, and they started, 10,000 BC, and they're just hugging the bottom there until where it just looks like they just swoop straight up. You see the same thing for life expectancy, and you see the same thing for literacy levels. We've had just an enormous liberation of human beings, liberation from poverty, liberation from ignorance, liberation from oppression and warfare into societies where individual rights are respected. So just breathtaking expansion in human possibilities made possible by industrialization. Now, the trick is realizing those possibilities. And there, I think, we can look at the past few decades and we can look at some metrics that show that we're stumped.
Yeah. So I want to understand what exactly we are up against here. And you've described the modern political system, the modern capitalist system as facing what you call a triple crisis of inclusion, dynamism, and politics. I'm wondering if you could just give a broad outline of those, and then we'll dig into a couple.
Yeah. So I mentioned what I see as the two hallmarks for a flourishing society or inclusion and dynamism. I think we can see a lot of metrics that show things are going the wrong way on both counts. On dynamism, economic growth in the advanced capitalist countries has slowed down in the 21st century relative to the 20th. The United States is an outlier in how well it is doing, and its average growth rate in the 21st century is down a third or 40% compared to the average in the 20th. The United States is a superstar compared to most of the rest of the advanced capitalist economies right now. Zero productivity growth, zero GDP per capita growth for years at a stretch is becoming more normal in Western Europe. This shows up not only in sort of abstractions like productivity numbers, but also just in the character of life. We saw over the industrializing era dramatic changes in the physical landscape of our lives, whereas now it's getting harder and harder to look at movies from the 21st century and pinpoint what year it is, right? You can look at any movie of the 20th century and know immediately what decade it is. So in all kinds of ways, our efforts to bend the physical world to our will have ebbed. We went to the moon and then we stopped. We developed supersonic transport and then we discontinued it. We developed nuclear power plants and we stopped building them. We declared ourselves developed countries, which means we're at the end of the line. We started making it insanely difficult to build anything new in our cities. We just established that, okay, that we're built, we're done. And then we, through historical preservation, started making it very difficult to tear anything down. And so there's this broader culture of stasis reflected in our slower growth numbers and our collapse of productivity growth. On inclusion, you can see a breakdown in social connectedness at both the macro scale and at the micro scale. At the macro scale, we are seeing the reemergence of class divisions, this time along educational lines. So over the middle decades of the 20th century, the very stark class distinctions between labor and capital were successfully blurred, and tensions which had given rise to the worldwide communist movement and therefore to the threat of nuclear war. You don't get more unstable than industrial capitalism's class conflict, right? That was a huge conflict, but we overcame it. In the middle of the 20th century, this sort of social democratic compromise sufficiently integrated the working class into capitalist society to make the whole thing stable and productive. But that entente has fallen apart. Basically, the old class conflict arose because of a deep dependence on technological progress on brute physical labor. To make the system go, you had to have a lot of dirty, dangerous jobs and people working in close proximity in dirty, dangerous jobs where it was easy for them to organize and push back against the tough bargain that they had signed up for. The dependence on brute labor produced the conflict. And so ultimately, technology has eased that conflict by making us grow out of this dependence on large inputs of physical labor as we've automated production more and more. As technological progress has grown independent of the contributions of ordinary workers, most firms now on the technological frontier have fairly small, highly trained technical workforces. They outsource everything else, either domestically or internationally. But the firms at the technological frontier now are firms of specialists. They don't require the contributions of ordinary workers in the way that they did in the past. And so on the one hand, that's a humanitarian triumph. We don't have all the hundreds of thousands of industrial accidents every year maiming people. We don't have the basic working man's bargain was to trade his physical health for money over the course of a career or maybe all at once. We've taken that grim bargain off the table. The ironic, unfortunate consequence of this is that because of this reduced dependency, the capacity of ordinary people to contribute to the common weal is reduced. The economic and sociological significance of what they do is reduced. So not only have we seen a big gap grow in the incomes between highly trained people and ordinary workers, but we've seen just a gigantic status divide. So that now we have this sort of clear meritocracy that you've got to get a 4-year degree and get a knowledge worker job to be a success. In 20th century industrial society, most people were workers. There was only a tiny rich class that people didn't feel like losers. They felt like ordinary folks.
They felt proud, right? And society actually bestowed respect upon the working class.
And everybody knew that the factory worker was absolutely essential to modern progress. He was glorified in culture, art, and music. The socialist movement, the Marxist ideology made him the protagonist of world history. So there's just nothing like that. There's no Art Deco murals of heroic Walmart greeters and call center employees these days. So the romanticization of work is gone. So today, working conditions are better, pay is better, people live at a higher material standard of living, but relative to the winners at the top, the gap is huge. And therefore, the satisfactions of work for ordinary people are generally less than they were in generations past. There was a real sense of accomplishment, flourishing, and pride in the move from immigrant tenement poverty to suburban ranch house, 2 cars in the garage, working middle class blurred, right? That was a huge transformation. And so even with the brutality of the work, even with the low pay and the primitive living conditions compared to now, I think those people felt like their lives mattered and succeeded in a way that is difficult for people to get that feeling out of their working life today, except for the lucky few. So we have this class divide at the macro level. Then at the micro level, we're just seeing social disintegration. That is the breakdown in vital personal relationships. Higher and higher percentage of people live by themselves. A higher and higher percentage of people report having no friends. The average number of close friends that people report is going down. The time people spend with their close friends is going down. The percentage of people that get married is going down. The age at which they get married is going up. The number of babies that people have is going down. The level of involvement in community organizations is going down. Attendance at church is going down. For all the glue that connects people together is coming unstuck. And this is especially apparent in the youngest generation, for whom the lure of virtual online existence turbocharges this disconnection. And so we've got teenagers now, they don't drive, they don't work after school anymore. They party and have sex less. Maybe that makes their parents less uptight, but they just spend a lot of time by themselves in their room on their phone. And for adolescents to spend all their time on technologies that do nothing but compare them to everybody else in the world, that's just about as unhealthy an environment as you could possibly imagine. And so we see this just outbreak of mental health problems amongst young people in rich countries. And so, yes, all kinds of metrics these days are showing that on the 2 big hallmarks of a flourishing society, dynamism and inclusiveness, we're not doing well.
So that's a really good high-level view. I'd love to dig in a little bit to both. On dynamism, it's talked about a lot. I think you could be forgiven for not necessarily intuitively feeling that. It feels like, okay, the economy is growing, there's new products, there's new social media apps all the time.
The conventional wisdom is that the pace of change is continuing to accelerate.
Right.
You hear that all the
There's
time.
There's AI now. But so I'm curious, like, what is stalling and why is progress and innovation slowing down?
Yeah. And so part of the reason it feels like everything is accelerating is that our time and our attention is scarcer than ever before. So we have so many calls on our time and so many buzzing, beeping distractions to pull us away from present moment that we just feel harried, right? So it feels like everything's in commotion all the time because our mental state is so distracted and harried and multitasking. And certainly in the online world, since the recent decades have been just a rocket ride of dramatic, ongoing, exponential progress. So the combination of those 2 things makes it easier to not notice that kind of everything else in life is not changed so much. There's some things that change, right? Medical care continues to improve. We invented fracking. That was a big change. A huge important in the United States. We're an oil exporters, the biggest oil producer in the world.
Energy independent.
But in general, productivity and innovation in the world of atoms slowed to a crawl since the 1970s. And a lot of that, I think, is cultural. It comes out of the environmental movement. So in the 1960s, humanity in the rich countries woke up and saw just what a dirty mess that we were making of things. There were some spectacular incidents. There was a great fog in the 50s in London that killed thousands of people with smog. There was a horrible oil spill when I was a kid off Santa Barbara in 1969, and we all saw those images of all the waterfowl covered in black. And the dawn of environmental consciousness occurred during the 1960s. I think that as your basic material needs are satisfied and you can take them for granted, you climb Maslow's pyramid and you don't stop worrying. You worry about new things. And one of the things you worry about is quality of life and quality of your physical surroundings and long-term healthiness, not just being full today, but being healthy decades from now. So it was a natural aspect of growing richer that we turned our attention to the problems of environmental despoliation. And it was probably inevitable that it provoked a technological backlash. You could conceive of it not. You could conceive of people seeing, okay, the technology has put us in the soup here. The only answer to technological problems is more technology. And so we need to invent our way out of this. So you could picture environmental consciousness galvanizing a new technological movement. Didn't happen that way at all. It went in completely the opposite direction. And I think in tune with larger trends in the 20th century of seeing the downside of technology, the mass slaughter of 2 world wars, the specter of nuclear destruction, the sort of naive belief that technological progress was all upside that we had in the 19th century was totally dispensed with during the 20th. And so it was natural, I think, to have a view of the dark side and appropriate, but it took over. And so we came to see industrialism as a cancer, and that really the answer was to slow down and be satisfied with simpler things and with less, or just at least figure out how to do things more efficiently so that we can maintain our standard of living, but with less environmental externality. And so overall, I think the whole orientation of our culture shifted from higher, faster, more, better to making do with less and economizing and conserving.
But I feel like, so just to comment on that, just so I can understand, I feel like if that was the case, then maybe we would have seen just a kind of a slowdown across the board. And what I feel like happened maybe was because of this cultural shift, things shifted heavily from the world of atoms to the world of bits.
Yeah. So
also the world of bits really awoke.
So the world of bits woke up. So it was a perfect timing thing. So at the same time that people were really freaked out about the dirtiness of industrialism, people were turning on to the glittering possibilities of frictionless, pollutionless online life. And so it looked like the answer, right? Yeah. There's a chart that was recently made famous in a wonderful, quirky book called Where is My Flying Car by J. Storrs Hall on energy consumption per capita, starting in around 1800. And you just have this exponential increase that he calls the Henry Adams curve, because Henry Adams, the American historian, was the first to discover this. But then in 1970, it just stops. It just flatlines. And so energy consumption per capita in the United States and other rich countries just flatlines in the early 1970s. The 90s or O's, if I had seen that chart, I would have said, whoa, way to go capitalism, the dematerialization of economic life, that we've shifted to away from dirty material progress to a cleaner kind of online progress. And so I would have looked at that completely complacent. These days, now seeing decades of no progress in the world of atoms and what that adds up to, and having an appreciation of all the political and legal and cultural barriers that stand in the way of anybody that wants to build anything big. Now I see that chart as that humanity just gave up. It stopped pushing the envelope. And maybe we can look back and see that it all worked out for the best, that we needed this pause to get our environmental house in order. But right now, as it happens, we are seeing a whole bunch of transformational technologies coming online again. So we've had this great stagnation, as Tyler Cowen called it, but we have the possibility of transformational technologies. Again, in online space, AI looming above everything. But in the world of hard tech, we've had just spectacular gains in solar and wind power and reductions in cost, so that we now can once again look at the idea of cheap energy, much cheaper than fossil fuels. We're seeing breakthroughs in new nuclear designs, and new interest in investment in small modular nuclear and other nuclear designs. We've seen technological breakthroughs in fusion and new interest in that. Spectacular gains in space technology through SpaceX, with a 90% reduction in launch costs and another 90% reduction on the way once Starship becomes reusable. So we're seeing all kinds of amazing technological possibilities in the world of atoms right now that are blooming. The question is, will our technology allow them to roll out and scale? And there, I think, we're seeing right now, we have a clear incentive to make a transition to clean energy. We know we have a problem. We know we need to fix it. And yet all of the transition in infrastructure is behind schedule, and it's all being held up by legal challenges and NIMBYism, the weird, perverse holdover of the environmental movement. The environmental movement was built on the instinct of, we got to stop bad people from doing bad things. But today, being a good environmentalist means helping good people to do good things, to build out the clean energy infrastructure so we stop cooking the planet, right? So, but this movement wasn't built for that, and it's still getting in the way. So,
and then you have oil companies using the tools that the environmental movement developed to stop new projects and things like this.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So a couple of points I just want to touch on here. So one is regarding the slowdown, or at least the shift from atoms to bits. I've read a few books about this, and I think people make amazing points in a lot of detail. I'm surprised one thing people don't really focus on is just how many of the smartest minds of the last few decades have gone into things like financial services, or things like ad algorithm creation, or just making very addictive social media apps. It feels like it just hasn't been a focus for brilliant young talent to go and build clean energy or just cool, beautiful things in the world.
Yeah, I think finance...
And that feels like a market failure, right?
Yeah, finance is another part of the picture, that it was part of our image of a clean economic future. Finance and computers, everything's online, everything's frictionless, everything's ones and zeros, no workplace injuries, no unions, no nothing, just everything's easy. And these were the kind of industries that people on the left could support. So when the Democratic Party made its shift to becoming a more pro-business party, it latched onto finance and Silicon Valley, because those were good kinds of big business. I think the enthusiasm and investment in online was all entirely appropriate. Of course, we were naive in thinking it would be only upside, and we were seeing a lot of dark sides of online life in the 21st century. And I think we overestimated the ability of it to just replace everything else. So we still have the rest of the world that needs to function appropriately. And so to some extent, people were pulled away from perhaps more important tasks to build a new Angry Birds or whatever. So I think that problem...
Well, that was time well used. That was a great game. But
I think that problem is more stark on the finance side. That is, there is growing belief amongst economists, and I share this belief, that our financial sector is too large, that there's a lot of economic evidence that when financial sectors are repressed and you don't have good systems for matching people with money with people with good business ideas, that's terrible for economic growth. So we got a lot of studies of that. It looks, though, like there's sort of a inverted U-shaped relationship between the size of the financial sector and growth, that from a low point, as the financial sector grows, it's good for growth, but then you reach a point that there's a maximum, and if you keep going, then it's bad for growth. And that we seem to be on the wrong side of things. One of the reasons is it diverts a lot of investment into stuff that banks can lend on. So most everything that produces innovation these days doesn't have collateral. The asset is in somebody's head, whereas banks all want to lend against physical assets and land. So you have too much investment in stuff that banks know how to do, and not enough investment in the stuff that actually makes GDP go up. Furthermore, I think you have a brain drain. You have the best and the brightest figuring out ways to shave a millionth of a second off trading times instead of building a better mousetrap. There's also this slowdown in growth could just be entirely natural. So there's no guarantee from existence that technological progress is going to be smooth. All right. You can think of sort of key inventions as opening up huge spaces for then entrepreneurial discovery and exploitation. We opened up these huge spaces with the internal combustion engine, and with electricity, and with modern chemical science, and then with computers. And over the course of the 20th century, we explored those spaces but we didn't open up too many new ones. And so we just squeezed the lemon as much as we could out of those things. And then we're waiting around for the next big thing. So maybe you just have to wait some. And maybe the next big thing is AI. Maybe the next big thing is fusion, or who knows, some general purpose technology whose uses in the economy are so widespread that they will revolutionize everything. And then it takes decades for that to happen. So it could be that we've just been in sort of a naturally fallow period, but I think it's pretty clear that we've developed a culture that was hostile in important respects to some kinds of economic growth, and we got what we asked for.
So just to ask a question to poke at this a bit, if we know now that, as you said, we need economic growth to even have the possibility of material abundance and therefore have a chance at some semblance of utopia, but obviously it's not a sufficient condition, necessary, but not quite sufficient. Does it matter? Shouldn't we maybe switch focus potentially? Could some people say that? Now we should focus on mass flourishing instead, and we've shown that just economic growth can't get us there.
Absolutely true that just economic growth can't get us there, but we need more economic growth to get us there. We're rich enough to see the possibility of mass flourishing. We're rich enough for 25 or 30% of people to be there, but we're not rich enough for everybody to be there. And we're not rich enough for anybody to stay there stably over the long term. So the first thing to solve the permanent problem, you can't solve it. It's not a one-time thing, but to address it fully in our time is to make our prosperity ecologically sustainable. And right now, our fossil fuel system and our factory food system are not ecologically sustainable. It's not a disaster. It's not an indictment of capitalism. They were both great. They got us rich, but we need to move to better systems. We need to move to clean energy. And then on the food front, half of our habitable land is consumed by agriculture. 70% of that's consumed by livestock. This puts enormous pressure on other species and on other habitats, end up causing horrendous environmental harms down the line, is just a petri dish for pandemics. The proximity of high-density animals and high-density humans mixed with globalized travel just means that we're just going to have more and more of them. And then finally, I'm a human chauvinist. I weight human welfare orders of magnitude above animal welfare, but I cannot rate animal welfare as zero. And I believe you would have to rate it as zero to see our current system as anything other than unconscionable. So right now, again, I'll live with that moral price, but we should be figuring out how to get beyond it. So the first step in successfully rising to the challenge of the permanent problem is resolving the conflict between our technological powers and the welfare of the rest of life on the planet. And then beyond that, I think we need to reconcile our liberating individualism of modernity with our needs as social animals. And so we need to develop new social arrangements that reconnect us with each other. And I think that will become a lot easier if we're a lot richer. So right now, people don't have to worry about starving to death, but that's not a real worry in rich countries. Some tiny fraction of 1% of people experience extreme poverty in rich countries on the level that 10% of the world still experiences. But still, you got to work 40 hours a week. You got to work till you're tired and too tired to do much of anything else every day, then recover on the weekends every decade until you're too old to do much of anything else. So our prosperity comes at a heavy price. And for most people, that time they spend paying for their life is in a low autonomy, no career track job with cruddy pay and no status. So we want to move beyond that world. And so I think the way to move beyond that world is to make the cost of living insanely cheaper than it is today. We have the capacity to do that. We will have the capacity to do that. So if we can get to the point where, double-digit percentages of people are independently wealthy to the point where they only need to work during their 20s and 30s, or they only need to work a couple of months a year, or they work a little while and then they don't, and episodically, so that their engagement in the labor market is voluntary and occasional, and the rest of their life is spent in sort of vital, tighter-knit, face-to-face communities where people live with people they like. They don't have to live close to their job anymore. They can live with family members and with friends in that kind of environment. Then raising children is no longer the sort of terrifying solo act it is for modern parents. The stress of child rearing is much less when everybody is at home and there are eyes on the street and kids can go out and play and be free range kids again. So I picture the possibility of a revived sociality made possible by independence from the need for the daily grind.
We definitely picture that possibility at Edge City as well. It's very much the goal, the philosophical underpinning of what we're trying to do. And I'm excited to get into some of the solutions here, but I do want to touch on inclusion, which was the second big part of the crisis you outlined. So you mentioned that the class divide is no longer really about money. It's much more about respect and agency in the work that one does. There's something interesting there where technology has made it easier for the people that were doing brute force work, but it also has made it much harder for those people to have a consciousness of themselves as part of some kind of unit or to organize in general. You say that there's much less respect now societally for working class people. This is just not a good state of affairs for obvious reasons. But it's also, from a political lens, this is fertile ground for populism. And it does feel like, as we see this broad decline of democracy around the world, do you think there's something related to that with this lack of agency in work?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we tend to approach this issue of inclusion through the prism of economic inequality, and we measure wage inequality. And that's happening, but it's just, problem is so much deeper than that. We have just completely grown apart. So we live apart. We've sorted geographic residential segregation on racial lines in the United States has ameliorated somewhat in recent decades, but residential segregation by income has gone way up. Sortative mating has gone up along educational lines. And so we live in, those of us in the professional managerial class, the 4-year university class, live in a bubble. We live separate from everybody else. We meet our own kind in college and make our life contacts there. All our friendships are work-based or college-based or growing up in the bubble-based. And so our connection to people of dramatically different walks of life is much less than it was when I was a kid. Therefore, naturally, you have less empathy and understanding for folks that you have no interaction with. And we've developed this really nasty culture war where ordinary people resent the know-it-all moral superiority of the elite, talking down to them about being racist, sexist pigs. And meanwhile, a lot of people in the professional managerial bubble look kind of scared of their fellow citizens. They think they've gone nuts and they voted a madman into office. And so you really have just a total breakdown in social solidarity where you've got like rival tribes that just actively hate each other. But we've talked about the two aspects of capitalism's triple crisis, the breakdown in dynamism and in inclusiveness. How do we deal with these things? We ought to try to deal with them through politics, but alas, the problems they're messing up our culture with dynamism and inclusion are also messing up our politics. And so as the politics of mass affluence is one in which the dividing line shifts from economic haves versus have-nots as that dividing line became less salient and less stark, and much more on cultural lines, and particularly belongs and belong-nots. The mainstream culture, which is the conservatives, and then everyone who is in some sense excluded or marginalized, women, minorities, criminal suspects, Native Americans, immigrants, all of those got bunched into, that's what the left care, that's what egalitarianism cares about now, not the working class, not about boosting pay for working men, but for boosting social acceptance and social status for and opportunities for marginalized people. And so the battle lines of politics have all shifted to culture. When you're fighting about money, it's really easy to split the loaf. When you're fighting about identity and that you are evil and trying to destroy the country and we're the salt of the earth, how do you compromise about that? So we get a much uglier politics. When politics is about your identity, your demographic identity, it just naturally conduces to performativity that instead of actually trying to, okay, we're in an identity group and our identity group is on the short end of the stick of some important respect. So there are some practical policies that could make things better. But that's not what you focus on. You focus on symbolic clashes that up our status in the public debate and reduce the other guy's status. So we have all of these clashes over nothing that are just symbolic clashes, and people just thinking that they are doing something important in life by rage tweeting all day. So politics has not only shifted onto an axis of conflict that's much harder to compromise, but the style of political action has shifted away from instrumental rationality, how to get good stuff for my team, to how to feel good about being on my team and how to make the other team feel terrible. And so where we have big problems to solve to deal with the institutional challenges of declining dynamism, and we need to develop new living arrangements to shore up falling inclusion. And for heaven's sake, we need to come up with some sort of cultural response to the fact that that we're not making nearly enough babies to keep our societies going. So there are urgent problems that are now coming to a head. So it's possible that for decades, by sorting and growing apart from each other, we were able to ignore each other, but the dysfunctions of our politics have now made us aware of each other and of our differences, made us aware in a very unhelpful, unconstructive way. But we see now that there's a problem. We are seeing, I think, and recognizing the problem of social disconnectedness too. So not only the macro scale disconnectedness through our politics, but our micro scale disconnectedness. And I think we're feeling that maybe all this is somehow or another tied together, that we're living wrong, that we're not living the way human beings ought to be living, that we need to touch grass and be connected with people again. So I think there's a hunger for that's happening. So that's the dialectic of history. Things go wrong, and the wrongness of it creates incentives for people to deal with it. So I'm hopeful now, not optimistic necessarily, but hopeful that there is enough awareness of these problems now that we could start to build momentum for experiments and solving them. And those experiments then can take off and scale.
Yeah. So we have these two big problems that you identified. And then the third is the ironic kicker, which is that the toolkit, or the way that we would normally solve these big societal things, which is the political system, that also has atrophied, and our ability to use that is not as strong as it was. And it just feels like democracy is starting to backslide. We're not able to reach agreement across ideological lines. So that's a little scary, I must say. But at the same time, it does, and this leads us very nicely into starting to think about solutions and reforms. And as our theory of change at Edge City it's very bottoms up. It's very almost orthogonal to current institutions and systems. Not that we're necessarily completely antagonistic or opposed. We're just going to try our own thing over here and just see how it works. Let's create spaces for experimentation, and then maybe we'll figure something out that we can merge back into mainline society. That's our approach. I'm curious, as you've been writing this book about these issues, how are you thinking about the solution space here at a high level?
Yeah. So at a high level, what we need, whether it will happen or not, I don't know. What we need is a kind of countercultural movement so that the system, the capitalist system, which consists of markets on the one hand and bureaucracy on the other, and bureaucracy is both in the public sector and private, that system is what's made us rich. But that system has a logic that isn't the same as the logic of individual human flourishing. And so it can make a lot of demands on us to fit into the system that are demands that make it harder for us to flourish. And both of these systems are systems of outsourcing responsibility from the individual to the system. So instead of making stuff yourself, you specialize in your job and then you outsource everything, all other production to the market and buy your stuff from us. And the government says, schooling your kids, taking care of your parents, all kinds of public goods that were dealt with at a community level, if dealt with at all in the past, we're going to take care of those. So these are great systems. They have given us stuff that we couldn't have had otherwise, but you can't achieve flourishing just inside the system because the system is all about outsourcing. The ideology of markets is consumerism. Just buy your way to happiness. The ideology of bureaucracy is managerialism. Manage those people until they're doing it right. But both of those kind of assume that the individual can't do anything for himself, that he needs the market to produce everything for him, and he needs managers to keep him in line because he's just totally hapless. And so we have stumbled into a world of learned helplessness and reduced agency and reduced initiative, where a lot of agency and initiative is drained out of society and into the professional and managerial classes. And that produces enemy and alienation in the larger body of ordinary folks. So yes, we have this ideology of outsourcing to managers or to the market. And we have followed that to the point where a lot of people don't have enough agency in their life and enough initiative in their life to make for fulfilling lives. And so we need to take things back. We need to take responsibilities back and do things for ourselves. Flourishing is ultimately effortful. You have to develop and realize your capacities, and nobody else can do that for you. So we can create environments that are conducive to that, but ultimately you got to do it for yourself. And so I look forward to a more decentralized world in which we still have large scale capitalism, because there are still economies of scale and they need to be exploited. And capitalism should be refocused on its core job of advancing the technological frontier and scaling it into better lives for all of us. And there's a certain group of people who are going to be in that game. And particularly even if people are in that game in humbler stations, if they're only in it for a little while on a more voluntary basis, then it will have a totally different feeling. But then when you're outside of that game, I picture a world where technology has developed to produce much more self-sufficiency at the local level. You can picture solar arrays or geothermal or small modular nuclear powering a town with vertical farms and meat cultivators and maker spaces and 3D printers. And so people can build their own houses and make their own stuff. And the designs for everything are online, but you can make them yourself. And it's fun to do. And you do it as part of your community. Ultimately, what are human beings for? They are for making other human beings and hanging out with each other and creating human communities, building physical worlds for themselves, and playing the human story again and again in as many different places and over as long a time span as we can do. And so to create social arrangements that allow kind of small scale people creating communities and enjoying them, that's the future I'm looking forward to. And I've just been delighted to stumble into the Edge City crowd and the kind of larger community that I had known nothing about beforehand, but which involves a lot of very smart, idealistic people who are thinking about how to build a brighter future, and in particular are thinking about how to build it on radically decentralized lines along the same lines as that I've been thinking. So it's just the craziest and most delightful experience to be off in my own little world and come up with this kind of, to me, alien, weird idea of where things ought to go from here. It's very different from my libertarian views of the past, where I was all about celebrating the division of labor and pushing it as far as you could go. Whereas now I think we need to retreat from it some. But then to stumble into another group of people who coming from a completely different starting point have a very similar overlapping vision of the future. So that's just been great fun to pivot from. In writing this book, I have spent a lot of time thinking about what's going wrong with the world, and that's a bummer. But then I started to think about how can the world be a better place, and that's fun and inspiring, but it's also a little bit terrifying because you don't see any ism devoted to this going on right now, so maybe it's not going to happen. But then you start looking around and seeing people in disconnected little pockets here building that future, and you start to think, then maybe it's going to happen. So
I love it.
Yeah, been a great experience.
I love it. Yeah, I'm so happy to hear that. This thing about the ism is so interesting because I feel split almost between worlds, because part of me deeply wants to see us travel through the stars and build nuclear reactors and just full on tech. Let's go, let's accelerate. And another part of me is very communitarian in my ideologies or feelings. I care about civil society. I care about co-ops. I care about that kind of thing. And it feels I can't really, there's no group of people necessarily, but they are here. There's a bunch of us.
Yeah.
And we're starting to coalesce around some of these ideas.
Yeah.
Experiment.
I wrote an essay called Why We Need the Jetsons and Solar Pump. So, and human nature is two-sided. It's communitarian and it's inquisitive and competitive, and we have to make room for both sides. And it's difficult, right? It's very easy to specialize on one thing. That's how political parties, they take one point of view and just run with it. It's very hard to keep two very disparate ideas in your head at the same time, but that's what we have to do to be successful humans.
This is why I love human flourishing as an idea and as a meme, because it encapsulates the individual, kind of the community being, but it also encapsulates humanity flourishing, humanity becoming a stellar species.
Here's another way to put flourishing that kind of ties together the two sides, which is we come into this world aware of our radical aloneness, right? That I'm the only person in this head. Nobody else can get in here. I'm separate from everything else in the world somehow or another. And yet I know at some profound level, there's all oneness too, right? So there's this weird, there's me versus the universe, right? And so all of life, all the successes of life are me reaching out to the universe and connecting. So connecting to other people and connecting to the world around me. And so, yes, we are communitarian. We need to connect to the people around us and build a life together. But we also are living in this world and we're curious about it. And it's a wonderland and we can't stop asking questions and then trying to figure things out. So both of those impulses are a drive to connect, and they are a drive, I think, that we have to honor.
Yeah, very well said. I have a thesis that I think the solution will be cultural, and I think it could actually happen faster than we think, because this is the power that we do have, and we can piggyback on technology that currently exists. There's obviously the internet, but there's a layer above, which I think of more as the meme layer, which it happens so quickly. As soon as a new idea gets formed, it spreads very fast. It gets remixed. It's very creative. This is actually maybe the one slight pushback I'd have on your point around dynamism. And you made the point that movies are same these days. I think that might be true in terms of Hollywood, but I think the interesting creative part of culture has seeped more into kids with phones and the things that they're doing on TikTok.
Entirely new
it's
mediums,
really,
right? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. It's quite profound. And so I think with Edge City, I think we can essentially bootstrap our own experience, show what's possible here, and then provide a blueprint or share our learnings, learn from others. And I think this can spread pretty fast once it catches on.
That's my model of social change really is, I think there's growing awareness, something's wrong. We're very rich and powerful. Why aren't we happier? Why hasn't progress in the art of living kept pace with progress in technology and progress in organization? There's clearly a felt dissatisfaction, and we see it most evidently in our politics. But then what's needed is to see an answer, right? To see some people on the ground doing something that looks like an answer to the problem. And so there's already the hunger for answers, and if people can start seeing them, then they'll imitate. So that's the job over the coming years is to light candles. And if enough of us could do that, then the light will spread and other people will want to follow on that path. But I don't think there's any way to get to this better world without a big cultural change, without a recognition that life outside the system is ultimately paramount and has to be prioritized, but not in a turn your back on technology kind of way, right? In a way that the whole point of our technology is to enable us to live great human life.
Yeah.
And we should orient our technological progress so it's pushing us towards better lives rather than pushing us towards worse. So, yeah, I think the example you're spreading is a salutary one, and other people are doing similar things. And I'm, like I said, hopeful about these sparks, and I hope they'll catch fire.
Yeah, well said. Final question from me. What was your experience like at Edge City Lanna when you joined us in Thailand last month? I'm curious, like very honest thoughts.
Yeah, I had a great time. I didn't know what to think. I had read a little bit about pop-up villages, so I had some idea, but I didn't know, and I had no prior interactions with this community of folks. And my sense of like the crypto world was that it came out of the sovereign individual libertarianism in a trustless, hyper-individualistic society. So seeing this pop-up village, which had Web3 associations, but focused on wellness and flourishing and multi-generational living, that all seemed, well, that's interesting. So when you contacted me, I got interested and definitely wanted to come and was curious from the get-go. But then when I got there, I just had the wonderful experience of being around a bunch of smart, optimistic, future-oriented people who are interested in ideas in a way that was refreshingly different from the kind of hard-bitten cynicism of Washington, D.C. That just a sort of an ingenuous interest in cool ideas and trying them out for size and playing with them, that kind of intellectual openness, revitalizing. So especially since I work at a DC think tank, I have to think about the crazy mess of Washington, DC politics and this was in the late stages of the election campaign. So that was obsessing everybody. To spend a week where nobody was talking about any of that at all. We were all focused on a better world. That was therapeutic. So I had a great experience, and I hope I can get involved in the future.
So wonderful to hear. And it was really cool to have you there. I think for us, we're really trying to start to bridge across and get outside of just the blockchain space, just the frontier tech space, even start to create a real diverse coalition of thinkers and builders here that can take us to that next stage. So I really appreciate you being there.
Great.
Cool. All right, Brink. Well, thank you so much.
It was great talking to you today. It's fun.
Take care.